Greetings, I'm Terry, and this is part of my supplementary material for my course on the Hieroglyphic Monad or Monus Hieroglyphica of John Dee. I'm looking at another wordplay here today, and this one has to do with Theorem 13. There's a really interesting pairing of terms there. The gold coral work is described as a pyronomic art, and so since a lot of this is really dense wordplay in Greek and Latin, and you're reading it in English, I thought I would devote a short wordplay video to it. So, first of all, the language in Theorem 13 is the kind of language someone might expect in a work of physical alchemy, like George Ripley's Compound of Alchemy. That is a work about how to change lead into gold or lead into silver. So, for instance, in the most dense part of this theorem, Dee says, and by the will of God, he is that most celebrated Mercury of the philosophers, the microcosm, and atom. Indeed, some of the greatest experts used to put the sun itself in his place and rank. This we cannot achieve in our present age unless we put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life, which has been separated from his body by means of the pyronomic art. And I would submit to you that to most readers, this is just opaque. It's the kind of thing you read and you think, what? Mercury is the microcosm and atom and the sun, and well, let's take it apart, because actually it's a beautiful and brilliant kind of wordplay. We've already talked about, and I'll put the link below, to how Dee was influenced by the Voarchidumia of Pantheus or Panteo, and that what he did especially was annotate in the margins things that interested him, and he was particularly interested in this phrase, the will of God, which doesn't sound perhaps like a lot to us in English, but it was very significant to Panteo and to Dee because the Latin gematria of nutu Dei or Dei nutu, and he puts them in there both ways in different places in the monad, is 72. And 72 is first of all, it refers us to the Shemham Foresh. It also refers us to processional astronomy. And when Dee uses it, it's pointing back at the work of Panteo himself. And as discussed in that earlier video, one of the things that puzzles people about Pantheus, let's be fair, the people who read Pantheus now are mainly reading him to figure out why Dee was so obsessed with him. I mean, he's not read greatly now. But Pantheus has this work that looks like physical alchemy, but he insists repeatedly that it is not a work of alchemy, that alchemy is a horrible thing, and he coins a word, archemy, which is not like archenemy, although it does sound that way. Archemy, he says, is spiritual development, not a seeking after riches. So I would call it alchemy, but he calls it archemy, is a development of the spirit, spiritual alchemy. And he's part of a long tradition of people who do this. John of Rupasissa is another, probably the most famous, who are saying that you want to develop your spirit. And they use the terms of physical alchemy, but they're talking about spiritual development. Now back to Dee. We've also talked about in the letter to Maximilian and a couple places earlier in the theorems about Dee's wordplay with Adam, and he can't really help it because Adam in Hebrew, and Dee writes Adam out in Hebrew in the letter to Maximilian, doesn't mean just Adam. It can also mean red. It can mean red earth, because of the fact that in Hebrew, the way Dee is writing it and the way it was written in that time, you don't have vowels. So you can add to Adam, red earth, you can add to those different Kabbalistic meanings, some of which those of you who are watching this and trying to do the homework with Theorem 13 may be encountering, like the idea of Adam Cadman, or the idea of referring to Zaur and Pin, that is, all of the Sephiroth that are surrounding Tifereth and including Tifereth, as another type of Adam. Then you add to that the prefigurings that of the New Testament that Christian Kabbalists put in when they appropriate Jewish Kabbalah for their own revelatory purposes. So then you get Adam prefiguring the Christos or Jesus. Now we're not even to the gold coral work, so let's look at that now. And let's just look at that sentence. D says, this we cannot achieve, becoming Adam. This we cannot achieve in our present age unless we put in charge of this gold coral work a certain breath of life, which has been separated from his body by means of the Pyronomic Art. Now, what is gold coral work? It might seem it's the hieroglyphic monad. Okay, but what's the hieroglyphic monad? So let's look at this word, because while most of the text is in Latin, there are a few words in Hebrew, Adam being one, as I've mentioned, and even more in ancient Greek, D being an expert in ancient Greek. So what Dr. Turner and I translated as gold coral work is a place where D precedes the Latin word for work, opus, with this Christocorallius, which is a form of Christocorallian, which would most easily translate as gold coral. And I say most easily because you only get there by puns, and I'll show you that in a minute. But it's used by one of the classical alchemists, Democritus, or actually people don't think it really was Democritus, but a pseudo-Democritus, that is somebody writing to sound like Democritus. And it refers to several different metals. Well, when we got to this, I did not, and Dr. Turner did not, try to figure out, oh, which metal is it? Because just by the sound, you can probably guess without even knowing a lot about this. Chrysos in Latin can mean gold, but when it means the reason it means that is in Latin is because of a pun. But okay, D is not writing in ancient Greece. He's not a contemporary of Democritus. He's in the Renaissance. This is 1564. So he'll know this pun, which is in a play by Plautus called the Bacchides. And in that play, there is a character named Chrysalis, and that name is itself a pun. Chrysalis means a clever slave, but it puns on chrysalis, which it means the same now in English. It's when a butterfly hatches out of a chrysalis, or instead of a cocoon, a worm spins a chrysalis. Think of a monarch butterfly. You have a little worm and it goes in and makes its little green chrysalis, and then it hatches out and it's a monarch butterfly. And changing from a worm into a butterfly is the subject of numerous analogies, usually involving a transformation into a greater, higher kind of beauty. So you know what a chrysalis is. Chrysos, this word, can also be a plant name, which is for black ivy, and then it puns on many other plant names, and Pliny, who's a great naturalist writer. So with black ivy, the most common, when you have the idea of something black that is going to transform, maybe lead into gold, maybe who knows. But the most obvious pun here takes us out of away from metals and plants. It's a pun on Christos, or Christ, as the anointed one, which is what Christos means. It's the same word without the T, which is what let us know that since D is projecting things onto the tree of life, and Jesus tends to be associated with the Sephiroth or the Pentagrammaton, as does gold, that's the easiest pun to look at. So Christos of Christ, the same word without the tau or the T. It's written the same way as a Roman T or a Greek tau. And sometimes you get references to a tau cross. You can just wiki that if you've never heard of it, but it's the idea that Jesus is crucified on the tau cross. And there's all kinds, some numerology you can do with that if you're interested too, since tau is associated with 300, but you can explore that on your own. So resurrected, the Christos becomes Chrysos, which is associated with Tiferet and or the surrounding Sephiroth of the Zawaranpin. Okay, that's taken us far from the gold coral work, hasn't it? It seems that the gold coral work is something like becoming the Chrysos. And indeed, we'll find out that it is. But let's look at pyronomic art, because that's the art associated with this. We put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life, which has been separated from his body by means of the pyronomic art. What is pyronomic? Well, if you know in English the term pyromaniac, you know that pyre is fire. Pyronomica in Dee's Latin Monus Hieroglyphica is a Latinized compound where he has taken two Greek words and put them together and called them a Latin word and written them with Roman letters. So fire, and then from nomikos, relating to laws. So relating to the laws of fire, I think we better dig in there a little deeper. So it's also a pun on the Greek word nomen, which is a part of the ancient sundials, well, modern sundials too, for that matter, have a nomen, but it's a little part. If this sun, the face of the monad, were a nomen, had a nomen, it would allow us to use it as a clock face. 24 theorems, 24 hours of the day. In fact, you could use a nomen to make clock ciphers out of it. But there's yet another pun, gnosis. That's the common Greek noun for knowledge. Though when you hear about someone having a moment of gnosis today, you don't usually think of it as meaning they learned something by cogitating over it as much as an insight. And that's exactly what it meant in Gnosticism. It was that moment where a person has spiritual insight into humanity's real nature. And this is humanity's real nature as good. So that insight leads to the start of a human being freed from the constraints of earthly existence, which, if you know Gnosticism, you know the Gnostics don't like earthly existence that much. It's the kind of dross that you're freeing yourself from, to use an alchemical metaphor. It's the start of the Gnostic ascent to the one. And we've talked about how the hieroglyphic monad itself can be seen as the journey of the Gnostic ascent of the one. Also the restoration of the Platonic idea of the good. Also the restoration of the perfect forms of the eternal world of being as opposed to becoming. So Dee's fire here seems, at least on one level, an interior flash or insight. Now, if there are Hermetic Kabbalists out there, and I'm sure there are because you're interested in John Dee, and that tends to draw a lot of Hermetic Kabbalists, you know that sometimes the tree of life is divided into different levels. There's the four worlds level, but then sometimes they are called planes, and there's an interior plane associated with the mental world. So that idea of the mental plane and that interior part of the tree of life meshes perfectly with this Gnostic idea of firing as an interior or mental flash of insight. Lastly, pure is a pun on pyramid. It doesn't mean pyramid, but it puns on pyramid, which is sometimes written out as pyramus. And it is such a common pun. Once people, like, they know these pyramids are down there in Egypt and other places, they think they can read the hieroglyphs, but they really can't. Thank goodness Dee didn't try. But they're interested in them. So am I, for that matter. Are you? I mean, pyramids are fascinating things. So it becomes a play on words that is really common, pier and pyramid. There is, in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, you may remember the play within a play where there's Pyramus and Thisbe. Dee's still alive when that play comes out, but closer to when Dee writes the Monad, there's simply a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, which is one of Shakespeare's sources in Midsummer Night's Dream. So those are some of the plays going on with pyronomic art. And a pyramid, whether Egyptian or not, what happens? There's a broad base and you go up to a point at the top. All right. So let's go back and look at this sentence. This we cannot achieve in our present age unless we put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life which has been separated from his body by means of the pyronomic art. Now that we have coral gold and pyronomic, there are a couple other words here we might want to look at just to fill in the meaning. The breath of life is coming from Latin anima. Now, in physical alchemy, that refers to the vapors that come off when you're firing the prima materia. There's like sulfuric vapors and that kind of thing. It's also often associated with the Greek psyche, the primary substance and source of life and consciousness. And I've told you when we were talking about the Timaeus that in that Pythagorean creation of the universe story, everything is alive. And by the time it's in the world of being, it's still alive and it's moving. Now, that doesn't really follow Christian doctrine. Neoplatonism is the absorption of Platonic thought, especially the concept of ideal forms, into Christianity in the Renaissance. But that doesn't mean that it's a perfect fit. And this is one of those places where they don't fit. Another is concepts of world ages, which I've talked about in another video. So while in Platonic, not Neoplatonic, but Platonic thought, everything is animated, that's not really the case in Judeo-Christian thought. So what this means then is animating something, ensouling it, giving it spirit. Sometimes it can also mean the element of air, although that's not terribly helpful in this instance. Body, you know probably what it means, but let's just expand the reference a little bit. Of course, we all have a body. Sometimes if you cut off the head and legs, I guess, it just means the torso. It can be a corpse if it's not animated. In geometry, it means a three-dimensional object like a cube or a cone. And while we might not use it that often, just keep in mind that in the Timaeus, as an example, in the world of being, the tetrahedron or hexahedron or octahedron, icosahedron, dodecahedron, those 5 perfect Platonic regular solids are animated. They are alive, just like the world that gets formed from mixtures of them. Also, it can just mean the physical structure of a person or organism from the 9th century on, and he's writing this 1564, and it appears to have that meaning particularly in the works of Paracelsus, and Dee has more copies of works of Paracelsus than any other writer. So Dee's pyronomic art you might think of is, well, if you're going to take a body and breathe life into it, that sounds like golem making, right? That is taking some mud or clay and fashioning a form and making it animated. Kind of the most famous golem maker would probably be a Rabbi Lowe of Prague, who is in Prague the same time as Dee and Kelly, 2 decades after this. So also within Jewish lore, you could think of a golem being made from red earth, because that's another meaning of Adam. There are some people who have argued, in fact, that the whole monad glyph is a golem, and I've got a reference to that below Karen DeLeon's chapter in a wonderful book edited by Stephen Klukas, John D. Interdisciplinary Studies in English Renaissance Thought, which if you have a academic library, they probably have a copy of it. But I will say, although her article is wonderful, it's not breaking things down quite to the micro level that I'm doing here. So let's go a little bit further with this idea of golem making. Another way to answer this question would be to consider how well Dee knew or didn't know Hebrew. And that's hard to answer because his compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah, written 2 years before the Monad, is lost. But we know he was collecting all kinds of Hebrew grammars. So we can guess, based on the Monad, if nothing else, and it's not the only thing, what he's interested in. He's interested in the Hebrew Bible and the Kabbalah. So does a golem appear there? And is it the same thing as you make this, this red earth that you have shaped like a human and breathed life into? It's not exactly that in the earliest commentaries. The trouble with this is it's possible, but we don't know for sure that he knew these commentaries. But it's in the Psalms, and he certainly would have gone over the Hebrew for the Psalms if he could have, and he did have a copy in his library of them, so let's assume that he would have done that. They're a golem, and it shows up on a possessive form as my golem. It's a Gimel Lamed Mem Yod. It means something like raw material or the light form of something. I'm saying where I got this from because, as I've said before, I study Hermetic Kabbalah, but I do not read Hebrew. I can do what I think Dee probably did, which is pick individual things apart. Also, if he happened to have access to any translation of the Mishnah, sometimes called the Oral Torah, but it's basically the first written down collection of Jewish oral commentaries, there we're told that a golem means an uncultivated person. So if one is progressing spiritually, presumably one is becoming more cultivated, more animated, and so on. So I'll read this one more time and think of what it means to you. He says, this we cannot achieve in our present age. Achieving the philosopher's stone, becoming the anointed one, moving up the middle pillar. What does he want you to achieve, and what is he telling you that you, if you understand this, can achieve? It seems to me what he's saying to you is something that he can't say in a more direct form, because again, it would be blasphemous. It's blasphemous within the Christianity of that time, and to some degree the Christianity of today, to say, oh, you know, be the Jesus you want to see in the world. That's a very, but become the Christos, become the anointed one. That's how I would interpret this, but you can interpret it however you want. We can't achieve it in our present age unless we put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life, which has been separated from his body by means of the Pyronomic Art. I would take this as a sentence or a statement about how you can become the anointed one by purifying oneself and working back up the middle pillar. And it's masked in the language of physical alchemy. But what he's talking about is spiritual alchemy. And as I've mentioned, you can simultaneously read it as the flash of insight that leads to the Gnostic ascent of the one, the restoration of the good by breathing life into all things, which via Plato's Pythagorean allegory, things are already supposed to be alive. And people who are reading the classics are reading that. It's just at the same time, they're Christians who don't believe that all things are alive. Okay. That's my supplementary material that hopefully will help you in understanding Theorem 13. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.